Hi, Miss Moskowitz here. Welcome to ELA. Today we're going to read Chapter 5, Part 1 of The Toil of Trace and Trail. And toil means hard work. And one of the things you're going to see when we read today is that the dogs are being completely overworked because of all the people coming in to prospect for gold. They all require mail delivery, letters, communication, and since the mail and the dogs carrying that mail are the only form of getting word from one town to another, from person to person, from business to business, the dogs are going to be just overworked and overworked, hence the word toil. So let's start reading, and I'm going to stop and explain a few things. Something to keep in mind, these are real events in the sense that this happened in history. The actual interplay between the characters is not factual, but the trails are factual, the settings are factual, the type of personalities and the jobs that people do are factual. All right, so let's start reading. 30 days from the time I left Dawson, the saltwater mail, with Buck and his mates at the fore or the front, arrived at Skagway. They were in a wretched state, worn out and worn down. Buck's 140 pounds had dwindled to 115. The rest of his mates, though lighter dogs, had relatively lost more weight than he. Pike the malingerer, who in his lifetime of deceit had often successfully feigned or pretended a hurt leg, was now limping in earnest or for real. So Lex was limping and Dub was suffering from a wrenched shoulder blade. They were all terribly footsore. No spring or rebound was left in them. Their feet fell heavily on the trail, jarring their bodies and doubling the fatigue of a day's travel. There was nothing the matter with them except they were dead tired. It was not the dead tiredness that comes through brief and excessive effort, from which recovery is a matter of hours, but it was the dead tiredness that comes through the slow and prolonged strength drainage of months of toil. There were no power of recuperation left, no reserve strength to call upon. It had been all used, the last least bit of it. Every muscle, every fiber, every cell was tired, dead tired, and there was reason for it. In less than 5 months, they had traveled 2,500 miles, during the last 1,800s of which they had but 5 days' rest. When they arrived at Skagway, they were apparently on their last legs. They could barely keep the traces taut or tight, and on the downgrades, just managed to keep out of the way of the sled. So as the dogs pull into camp, they're at the point where they cannot make it anymore. And the mail delivery team, their typical way of dealing with this is to sell the dogs, buy new dogs, and start fresh. There's loyalty for you, huh? Mush on, poor sore feet, the driver encouraged them as they tottered down the main street of Skagway. This is the last. Then we got a long rest, eh? For sure, one bully long rest. The drivers confidently expected a long stopover themselves. They also had covered 1,200 miles with 2 days' rest, and the nature of reason and common justice, they deserved an interval of loafing. Loafing means just like relaxing, chilling out. But so many of the men who had rushed into the Klondike, and so many were the sweethearts, wives, and kin or family that had not rushed in, that the congested mail was taking on alpine or mountainous proportions. Also, there were official orders. Fresh batches of Hudson Bay dogs were to take the place of those worthless for the trail. The worthless ones were to be got rid of, and since the dogs count for little against dollars, they were to be sold. 3 days passed, by which time Buck and his mates found how really tired and weak they were. Then on the morning of the fourth day, 2 men from the States came along and bought them, harness and all, for a song. Buying something for a song means it's for like very little, for almost free. One of the reasons this would be is that the dogs are so worn out that they're almost useless at this point. Any normal person or humane person would give the dogs a break. The men addressed each other as Hal and Charles. Charles was a middle-aged, light-colored man with weak and watery eyes and a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, giving the lie to the limply drooping lip it concealed. Hal was a youngster of 19 or 20, with a big Colt's revolver and a hunting knife strapped about him on a belt that fairly bristled with cartridges. This belt was the most salient thing about him. It advertised his callowness, a callowness sheer and unutterable, Both men were manifestly out of place, and why such as they should adventure to the north is part of the mystery of things that pass understanding. Now, Jack London was sort of one of these men that he's describing here because he went to the Klondike completely innocent, not aware of any of the dangers. Callowness means awkward. Salient means important. One of the things when we look back up at the descriptions of Hal and Charles, I really like this one right here. So you start with Charles, who's lightish colored with weak and watery eyes, which gives you the idea that this is a character who's possibly not to be trusted or not very powerful. And I really love, this is one of my favorite descriptions of all time, a mustache that twisted fiercely and vigorously up, right? So like a mustache implying a smile, giving the lie to the limply drooping lip it concealed. So underneath what appears to be this smiling, friendly face is actually a frown. So he's got this inner self that is not surface. And so that's Charles. Hal, who's only 19 or 20, has this big giant gun and hunting knife and filled with ammunition. And it's just, you look at him and you just see this gun. And so it kind of shows how inexperienced he is. Maybe he should have a shovel or something useful rather than all these weapons on hand. So both of these men do not belong in the Klondike, but they're there because of the gold rush. Buck heard the chaffering, saw the money pass between the man and the government agent, and knew that the Scotch half-breed and the mail train drivers were passing out of his life on the heels of Perrault and Francois and others who had gone before. When driven with his mates to the new owner's camp, Buck saw a slipshod and slovenly affair, 10 half-stretched, dishes unwashed, everything in disorder. Also, he saw a woman. Mercedes, the men called her. She was Charles's wife and Hal's sister, a nice family party. This is the first time we see a female character introduced who's a human, but we'll just see what you think of her by the end. Okay. Before we start reading this part, I want remonstrance means arguments. It's important. So these are a tight little family. You have, you're going to see her name is Mercedes, and she's married to Charles, and her brother is Hal. Probably her younger brother. Buck watched them apprehensively as they proceeded to take down the tent and load the sled. There was a great deal of effort about their manner, but no business-like method. The tent was rolled into an awkward bundle 3 times as large as it should have been. The tin dishes were packed away unwashed. Mercedes continually fluttered in the way of her men and kept up an unbroken chattering of remonstrance or arguing and advice. And when they put a clothes sack on the front of the sled, she suggested it should go on the back. And when they had put it on the back and covered it over with a couple of outer bundles, she discovered overlooked articles which could abide nowhere else but in that very sack, and they had to unload it again. So this is a demanding woman. 3 men from a neighboring tent came out and looked on, grinning and winking at each other. "You got a right smart load as it is," said one of them, "and it's not me should tell you your business, but I wouldn't tote that tent along if I was you." "Undreamed of," said Mercedes, throwing her hands up in dainty dismay. "However in the world could I manage without a tent?" "It's springtime, and you won't get any more cold weather," the men replied. She shook her head decidedly, and Charles and Hal put the last odds and ends up on top of the mountainous load. "Think I'll ride?" one of the men asked. "Think it'll ride?" one of the men asked. Now, one of the reasons he's asking this is one of the rules of dog sledding is you really want to compact your materials to the lightest amount possible, and they're just piling it on. They have way too much materials. They have every pot, pan, or recommended piece of camping material or surveying material that anybody has recommended. All right. "Why shouldn't it?" Charles demanded rather shortly. "Oh, that's all right. That's all right." The man hastened meekly to say, "I was just wondering, that's all. It seems a mite top heavy." Charles turned his back and drew the lashings down as well as he could, which was not in the least well. So these people think they know everything, even though they're newbies, and basically all the good old boys are laughing at them. "And of course the dogs can hike along all day with that contraption behind them," affirmed the second of the men. Certainly, said Hal with freezing politeness, taking hold of the gee pole with one hand and swinging his whip from the other. Mush, she shouted, mush on there. Now, I'm going to read this part straight through. And before we start, I want you to remind you that these dogs have traveled way beyond the physical capabilities of dogs like this. They need a break. And to top it off, the wagon weighs too much, and suddenly they have these three people in charge of them who do not know anything. Like up to this point, Buck has always trusted whoever is in charge of him and followed their lead. So what we need to see now is when you put inexperienced people at the front of these dogs, how are they going to react? And repugnance means disgust. Okay. The dog sprang against the breastband, strained hard for a few moments, then relaxed, and they were unable to move the sled. The lazy brutes, I'll show them, he cried, preparing to lash out at them with the whip. But Mercedes interfered, crying, Oh, Hal, you mustn't, as she caught hold of the whip and wrenched it from him. The poor dears. Now you must promise you won't be harsh with them for the rest of the trip, or I won't go a step. Precious lot you know about dogs, her brother sneered, and I wish you'd leave me alone. They're lazy, I tell you, and you've got to whip them to get anything out of them. That's their way. You ask anyone? Ask one of these men. Mercedes looked at them imploringly or beggingly, untold repugnance at the sight of pain written in her pretty face. They're weak as water, if you want to know, came the reply from one of the men. Plumb tuckered out, and that's the matter. They need a good rest. Rest be blank, said Hal with his beardless lips. And Mercedes said, Oh, in pain and sorrow at the oath. But she was a clannish creature, and rushed at once to the defense of her brother. Never mind that man, she said pointedly. You're driving your dogs, and you do what you think is best with them. And again, Hal's whip fell upon the dogs. They threw themselves against the breastbands, dug their feet into the packed snow, got down low to it, and put forth all their strength. The sled held as though it were an anchor, and after 2 efforts, they stood still, panting. The whip was whistling savagely. When once more Mercedes interfered, she dropped on her knees before Buck with tears in her eyes and put her arms around his neck. You poor, poor dear, she cried sympathetically. Why don't you pull hard? And then you wouldn't be whipped. Buck did not like her, but he was feeling too miserable to resist her, taking it as part of the day's miserable work. One of the onlookers, who'd been clenching his teeth to suppress hot speech, now spoke up. It's not that I care a whoop of what becomes of you, but for the dog's sake, I just want to tell you that you can help them a mighty lot by breaking out that sled. The runners are froze fast. Throw your weight against the gee pole, right and left, and then break it out. Now this is the worst. Their ignorance is preventing them from functioning, but it's also torturing these dogs. So they're whipping the dogs and trying to get them to go, but meanwhile, the tracks that the sled is in are frozen into the snow. And this man is like, "Look, I don't care what happens to you people. I don't like you, I don't respect you, but for the sake of those dogs, break out the tracks." A third time the attempt was made, but this time, following the advice, Hal broke out the runners, which had been frozen to the snow. The overloaded and unwieldy sled forged ahead, Buck and his mates struggling frantically under the rain of blows. 100 yards ahead, the path turned and sloped steeply into the main street. It would have required an experienced man to keep the top-heavy sled upright, and Hal was not such a man. As they swung on the turn, the sled went over, spilling half its load through the loose lashings. The dogs never stopped. The laden sled bounded on its side behind them, and they were angry because of the ill treatment they had received and the unjust load. Buck was raging. He broke into a run, the team following his lead. Hal cried, Whoa, whoa! But they gave no heed. He tripped and was pulled off his feet, and the capsized sled ground over him, and the dogs dashed up the street, adding to the gaiety of Skagway as they scattered the remainder of the outfit along its chief thoroughfare. So, when the dogs, because when something's like stuck, like, and you finally, like, there's all that inertia and momentum. So when it finally gets unstuck, the dog's Buck just takes it flying. And so the sled rolls over, all the stuff gets scattered throughout the town. And so the people who live in the town who don't like these, interlopers anyways, find this hilarious. There's not a lot, like this is very amusing to them. And amusing to me too. All right. Kind-hearted citizens caught the dogs and gathered up the scattered belongings, and also they gave advice. Half the load and twice the dogs, if they ever expected to reach Dawson, was what they said. Hal and his sister and brother-in-law listened unwillingly, pitched tent, and overhauled the outfit. Canned goods were turned out and made men laugh, for canned goods on the long trail is a thing to dream about. Blankets for a hotel, quote one of the men who laughed and helped. Half as many is too much. Get rid of them. Throw away the tent and the dishes. Who's going to wash them anyways? Good Lord, do you think you are traveling on a Pullman? So Mercedes is furious now because she's very vain. She loves her fancy clothes. Here we go. And so it went. The inexorable elimination of the superfluous, or the extra. Mercedes cried when her clothes bag were dumped on the ground and article after article was thrown out. She cried in general, and she cried in particular about each discarded thing. She clasped hands about knees, rocking back and forth broken-heartedly. She averred she would not go an inch, not for a dozen Charleses. She appealed to everyone and to everything, finally wiping her eyes and proceeding to cast out even articles of apparel that were imperative necessities. And in her zeal, when she had finished with her own, she attacked the belongings of her men and went through them like a tornado. So when she gave into it, she's really going and having no mercy. They accomplished the outfit, though cut in half, was still a formidable bulk. Charles and Hal went out in the evening and bought 6 outside dogs. These added to the 6 of the original team, and Teak and Kuma, the Huskies obtained at the Rink Rapids on their record trip, brought the team up to 14. But the outside dogs, though practically broken in since their landing, did not amount to much. They were short-haired pointers. One was a Newfoundland, and the other 2 were mongrels of indeterminate breed. They did not seem to know anything, these newcomers. Buck and his comrades looked upon them with disgust, and though he speedily taught them their place and what not to do, he could not teach them what to do. They did not take kindly to trace and trail, and with the exception of the 2 mongrels, they were bewildered and spirit broken by the strange, savage environment in which they found themselves and by the ill treatment they had received. The 2 mongrels were without spirit at all. Bones were the only thing breakable about them. So you take all these new dogs, and they're much more like what Buck should have been when he came. These are dogs that are not used to the trail. They're just like you took somebody's house pets and just hooked them up to a sled. And so Buck can discipline them. So if they do something wrong, he can kind of nip them or let them know in dog style, like that's not right. But he can't communicate to them how to be a good sled dog, how to lead, they don't have it in them. And they don't have a lot of spirit about themselves either. With the newcomers hopeless and forlorn, and the old team worn out by 2,500 miles of continuous trail, the outlook was anything but bright. The 2 men, however, were quite cheerful, and they were proud too. They were doing the thing in style with 14 dogs. They had seen other dogs' sleds part over the pass for Dawson or come in from Dawson, but they had never seen a sled with as many as 14 dogs. In the nature of Arctic travel, there was a reason why 14 dogs should not drag one sled, and that was that one sled could not carry the food for 14 dogs. For Charles and Hal did not know this. They had worked the trip out with a pencil, so much to a dog, so many dogs, so many days. Oh, QED, Mercedes looked over their shoulders and nodded comprehensively. It was all very simple. So these people who have no experience at all just did the math. Oh, a dog needs to eat X amount a day. And make a prediction here, their math might not be very good. All right, so here we're going to pause. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and when we come back, we're going to continue with Mercedes for the next lesson. I hope you guys have a great day. Mercedes is really, I can't stand her. She's a terrible character. I mean, she's a good character, but don't like her as a character. All right, you guys have a great day. Bye.